Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Today we're joined by François Godement. He's a special advisor at the Institut Montaigne and one of Europe's most respected voices on China policy. As tensions grow over trade, technology, Taiwan and transparency, EU-China relations face historic tests. With a high-level EU-China summit underway, Europe must balance economic engagement with democratic values and strategic autonomy. We explore how the EU can protect its interests while managing its fragile but essential relationship with Beijing. Mr. Godement, welcome to TVP World and thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you.
So let's start with big picture stuff. How would you characterize the EU-China relationship as a whole?
It's never been as intense in terms of trade, because in spite of every problems, trade is growing, and particularly China's sales to Europe, of course, it's asymmetrical, and it's never been so strategically tense. We don't only have trade issue, we have the issue of a Chinese foreign minister declaring quite openly to an EU official that China cannot tolerate a loss of Russia, a defeat of Russia in Ukraine. That's departing, of course, from the neutrality that China claims. And we have numerous issues starting from measures taken by China to prevent rare earth export, or rather to submit importers of rare earth to a process that includes unspoken political conditions, to European attempts to protect its EV market, and now also the public medical device market, a number of obstacles that make the coming summit very, very difficult.
So how would you characterize the priorities of the European Union? On the one hand, you know, we're talking about Central Eastern European countries who are very invested in the war in Ukraine and supporting Ukraine, as well as, of course, the Baltics and others. And then in other parts of Europe, all they want to do is sell Chinese goods. How would you prioritize the EU's demands or requirements?
Well, first, I should say that the contradiction runs through almost all EU countries. If you look at the upsurge in Chinese exports to the EU, the countries where it has risen most in recent months are precisely Eastern European countries, including Baltic states. Their commercial or economic dealings are quite separate from the strategic issues. And that is probably valid for the whole Union. Second, the EU, unfortunately, also has to contact with Donald Trump and his administration, who is at the same time exercising unprecedented coercion through threats of trade tariffs, which means the relations with China and the US are really a triangle. And they are happening in real time at the same time. Mrs. von Leyen and her team will be in Beijing on July 25th, but Trump's threats could come true, could materialize on August 1. That's what he has announced, a 30% surtax on every import from Europe. So it's a huge pressure, which makes it extremely difficult for the EU to be otherwise than, I should say, tactical. Try and seek with each partner where the pressure might be let off, where there could be concessions, where perhaps they would worry more about each other than they do about Europe. Doesn't look too good.
It's clearly a very delicate balance, and I do want to talk about the US-China-EU triangle. But I mean, fundamentally, why does the EU need China?
Ask the consumers. The consumers love Chinese goods. The consumers love the cheap Chinese goods, which are in our supermarket shelves, which are going upscale in terms of technology. ask the people who invest in wind industry or solar industry or a number of other key sectors. Europe is not even foremost in taking industrial goods for infrastructure investment, except in telecom for some countries. But China is more and more competitive. And there's a reason for that also. It's going through a phase of very long deflation, especially for industrial prices. It's subsidizing its production, and therefore it is becoming more and more competitive with what, of course, the EU claims, probably rightly so, is a tilted playing field, not an even playing field.
Well, it is a tilted playing field.
And deflation.
It is a tilted playing field, and one does wonder how sustainable it is. I mean, you've just described China's economic woes. I mean, there are other countries that make low-cost goods, and some companies are moving to those places, like Vietnam or India and so on. Do you anticipate a situation where EU reliance on China actually reduces?
In principle, this should happen. In reality, countries like Vietnam, since you named it, and others, are really relays for Chinese exports with often Chinese investments that then will circumvent any kind of trade tariffs and go to their ultimate goal, which is the big markets, including ours. That's number one. So you know, many enterprises, many firms will say we now have a China plus one strategy. We want to build elsewhere a resource so that we're not dependent on our investment in China, on prices that China would inflict on us, on technology that it would restrain. But in practice, more and more, China plus one means China and China. You meet China in third-party countries, and that's very important and a real problem that we haven't tackled yet, because we have tackled direct imports or direct investment from China to some extent, but we haven't tackled what goes through third countries. That will, by the way, also be a U.S. problem.
Right. Well, you mentioned the U.S. I'd like to spend our last couple of minutes talking about that. Give us the dynamic as you currently see it between the U.S., China, and the EU, and how you expect that to change on the 1st of August, if at all.
It's very hard for me. I'm not in the negotiating room. And, you know, from what we hear, the people in the negotiating room are not those who decide. Donald Trump has the ultimate power of decision and exercises it frequently and changes his mind. So we can only rely on what do we think of Donald Trump's bargaining tactics. We know he bluffs. We know he can move back very quickly. We know he has his sometimes obsessive priorities, like German cars, for example, which he didn't like in the streets of Manhattan even 20 years ago. So it's a very difficult game. We also know that, unfortunately, or rather U.S. custom duties inflicted on us will become budgetary receipts for the U.S. Handy if you have a big budget deficit. And that's a big problem that we don't know yet whether the huge tariffs that Donald Trump and his administration are talking about, whether they will ultimately hurt the U.S. economy, the U.S. economy, of course, or whether it will in fact help to rebalance the public budget, and therefore, because the U.S. has other attractions as a market and as a safe haven, it would ride through these extraordinary events.
Is this an opportunity for China to step in and say to the EU, hey, listen, why are you selling to the US? You know, sell us some of your technology, your high tech, and so on?
China has always been seeking to obtain more high tech from us. That's not new. It's something that they routinely do. And in fact, you know, when there were, and there still are, restrictions on arms exports to China, they always hinted that, well, if you lifted those restrictions, you'd sell so much more to us, and we'd all be very happy and we'd balance our trade. So that's unfortunately not a solution. The other problem is that China looks, even when it's talking to the EU, it looks over its own shoulder at the US. What's going to happen with the US, which right now is clearly the toughest partner, the toughest adversary, quite unpredictable. And so China at times had made some verbal concessions to the EU to try and soften EU negotiators or the general political climate on China, but has not made up to now any significant concession in the areas we're talking about.
Right, so China's being fairly rigid as well. In the last couple of minutes that we have left, I'd like to go back to something you mentioned earlier. China has said that they simply do not want to allow Russia to be defeated in Ukraine. Now, that's a big problem for the EU, considering how much they are investing in the support of Ukraine. How do you square that circle, Mr. Godement?
It could be squared eventually because we're not necessarily talking about full defeat or full victory for either side. Not even the EU, I think, down in the bottom of our heart or our brain, think that Ukraine will be able to regain all its lost territory since 2014, or even perhaps some of it since 2022. But the issue is whether Russia is forced into a negotiation and forced into something that would be more than a temporary ceasefire, that would be an admission that this is where the bucket stops. This is where the aggression will stop in the future. And that's not a given. It's not something that Mr. Putin is ready to give. So we do have a contradiction with China.
He doesn't seem to be at the moment. Monsieur Godement, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. But do come and see us again shortly, especially after the summit is over. Have a good evening, sir.
Sure. Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you. Bye now. That brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Bye now.